Thanks for inviting me to talk to you from my home today. As I was telling the group before, this is my first go at a talk like this through a Zoom platform, so hopefully it will go smoothly. We're going to talk today about basic de-escalation strategies. We're going to talk a little bit about how major mental health disorders and trauma interact with each other. Talk about prevention strategies, because when you talk about de-escalation, prevention is still kind of your best way to start. And then we'll talk about how escalation occurs, which is a tricky thing because sometimes it occurs very quickly. And I know even in my own personal experience, there's times where I've experienced an escalation and the first thing that comes to your mind is, where did that come from? It comes out of the blue. It can come on very quickly. And it does disrupt your ability to kind of think things through. And I've even been in situations where it has escalated all the way up to physical altercation with an individual. And at the end of it, you kind of sit down and think, did I do everything correctly? Because, it's difficult to manage our emotions in those situations. And it interferes, our own emotions then begin to interfere with our ability to think clearly and to think progressively and actively. And so it is good to talk about these things ahead of time so that you have a sense of what types of tools you have at your disposal, and even to practice them. It's because some of these things don't come natural to us. And so it's important to realize that you're learning a skill. And like with any skill, you become better at them with practice. Whether it's playing a piano or pitching baseball, anything that you start, you don't do very well at the beginning, and you do have to take time to learn these types of skills. So keep that in mind as we talk today too, on how you can rehearse these things and prepare yourself for situations that are more difficult. So when I was talked with about this presentation, it was about, you're working with more people now in our community that are what we refer to as dually diagnosed from a developmental disability perspective. And that is, we have more people on our roster that have developmental disabilities, but also have some type of major mental health problem as well that they're trying to cope with. And it can be a wide variety of things: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression. Schizoaffective disorder is a very popular diagnosis with the individuals we work with. And basically that type of disorder is kind of an amalgam of all different types of things, of mood disturbance, of thought disturbance, all kind of rolled up together. And can give you a very unusual presentation. I don't know why I put major depression twice. Maybe it's because I'm depressed that I'm working from home. I don't know. But it can also include other, maybe not as major disorders, such as obsessive compulsive disorder. Some people may have phobias, things of that nature as well. I'm not going to talk a lot about the different mental health disorders, though, because from a point of view of how you're going to respond to escalating behavior, it kind of all falls back to trauma anyway. And when you look at the prevalence of trauma with individuals with developmental disabilities alone, the prevalence that I come across the most is that it's at about 95%. So if you have someone with a dual diagnosis, a mental health problem as well as a developmental disability, you're basically going to be working with someone who has trauma that has impacted their life. Because sources of trauma are many, and even just having a mental health disorder can be traumatizing to an individual. Just having a developmental disability diagnosis can be traumatizing because it can be isolating. It makes you feel different from other people. You know, I think back even to my own personal experience, and I always try and relate my personal experience to what I'm talking about, or even when I'm learning things, because the people we work with really share more with us than what we realize. So I think about my own personal experience of feeling different or feeling isolated, such as when I had to wear my back brace in high school and the beginning of college. That was very noticeable, and how it, you know, it just made you feel outside of the norm and not like other people, and that created anxiety for me. You know, I know I've shared this, you know, my father got a teenager pregnant when I was in high school, and I remember how isolating that felt to me, and that too was very traumatizing. But with people with mental health problems, a large source of trauma is even just the environment, the home which they come from. For most mental health disorders, there is a genetic link. So oftentimes, the individuals we see have parents, brothers, sisters, uncles, cousins, who also have mental health problems. And when you have a household where there is significant mental health problems, they're often very chaotic. They're often very unpredictable, and we know this in of itself is a source of trauma for people. When you don't know what's going to happen next, when someone's going to explode, when something bizarre is going to happen. Often with major mental health problems, there's also substance abuse. So not only may you have a dually diagnosed, but you may have a tri-diagnosable type of condition where there's, you know, mental health disorder, substance abuse disorder, developmental disabilities. And so it all kind of layers on each other. A lot of times in these homes, there's absence of resources, which can be traumatizing. You know, not enough food in the home. I work with one individual now who comes from a history of that and has a very complicated relationship with food now that makes his life very difficult because of that food scarcity. A lot of times people in these homes end up being jailed because of unusual or disruptive behavior in our communities. And so individuals are incarcerated from the home. So all these sources of trauma really impact an individual's development through their early years. And of course, and I know a lot of you have had quite a bit of education already on trauma and how it impacts people. And we all know that, you know, the younger someone is that trauma experience occurs, the greater impact it has. If there are genetic issues, you know, they may have fewer internal resources to deal with the issues in their environments. And so that makes them more vulnerable as well. And often these homes have, you know, they don't have broad social networks, because even with mental health, just like with developmental disabilities, oftentimes these families aren't well networked in the community. People don't come to see them. And I came across an interesting analogy one time where someone talked about, like, if you know someone who's gotten a diagnosis of heart disease or cancer or a neurological disorder, you know, we'll oftentimes go to their home, we'll bring them food, we'll show them sympathy, you know, and support, and let them know, you know, what can I do for you to help you through this? I remember even when my wife had her horseback riding accident, how supportive all the employees at the board were and were concerned about my well-being and as well as my wife's well-being. And that helps. But when people are diagnosed with things like schizophrenia, we tend not to go to their homes. We tend not to bring them food. We don't make a hot dish for them or an apple pie. We don't tell them, what can I do for you? So those social networks often aren't there as well. And so we know that the impact of the trauma, you know, just kind of gets multiplied by these types of factors. And of course, one of the major things and what we're most concerned about is that ability to self-regulate trauma responses when people feel re-traumatized, when triggers show up in their environment that, you know, they don't have that capacity internally or externally to help them manage those types of things. So it's important to kind of realize what we can do to help people prevent the re-traumatization, to have that trauma response as they go through life in different situations, but then also how do we mitigate it when they are experiencing these types of things.
Dean, we have a question from Pam.
Sure.
Pam asks, Dean, can this genetic predisposition be affected through epigenetics?
Well, yeah, I don't know a lot about epigenetics. The little bit that I do know is that they're finding out that experiential things, even during gestation, can affect the development, you know, obviously of the fetus and genetic expression. And they're usually tied to what are referred to as methyl groups that get attached to genes, which can disrupt normal genetic development during gestation as well. So the answer is yes. Do I know exactly how that works? Not exactly. And I know that this is still, you know, kind of a newer science anyway in the genetic field, where they continue to look at how experiences affect gene expression. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So what is the goal of behavior escalation? You know, we always talk about behavior as being a communication, that it's not just there to be there. It's telling us something about that person or that individual. I'm being blinded by the sun. I'm going to try and turn a little bit here, see if I can get out of the sun. There, that's better. So what is it trying to communicate to us? Well, the first thing for me that I think about is when I see somebody starting to become anxious or angry or irritable, is that they're experiencing something internally that is making them uncomfortable. Okay? It's being generated from maybe a number of different sources, whether it's from a trigger for a trauma memory, or it's, you know, and it could be even the way we engage them that creates that trigger. I know I've triggered people at times inadvertently, whether it's I use touch inappropriately, or I've asked too many questions of them. You know, it can be something small like that. It can be how you're standing next to them or over them that can be a trigger. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So, so they're experiencing something that they have to resolve. It's something that's uncomfortable. It's a feeling that's telling them that at this time, I am experiencing a potential threat and I need to protect myself. So the goal then also becomes to go into protection mode, right? And they're protecting themselves from a perceived threat. It may not be a threat that we actually see, but it's something that they feel inside of them. They feel threatened in some way and need to respond. And the way it gets talked about mostly, at least in my experience, is that we typically see anger, or at least that's the emotion that concerns us the most, right? Because anger is probably the most disruptive of the emotional experiences that we see, or can lead to dangerous situations for the person as well as for others. Although we have to understand that the anger is probably representing other emotional experiences as well, including that kind of beginning fear, right? And when we talk about trauma and we talk about threat, really the emotion we're talking about is fear, anxiety. And oftentimes depression is part of that, because individuals experience feelings of helplessness or hopelessness in their life. And so that can be debilitating as well. And we'll talk about how these emotions get represented. And then it can lead to that anger. So why does it escalate to anger? Because oftentimes they learned in the past that the individual, that this is how I get rid of this feeling. This is how I get it out of me and feel safe. This is how I can gain back control of my environment. And I think about it in terms of a lot of our individuals often don't feel like they're heard. And the only way they got heard is by being very intense in their expression of what their needs are. And so we see this escalation to a more activated type of an emotion so that people will listen to them. You know, don't touch me. Don't touch my stuff. You know, and perhaps if they said things like that with a little bit of anger, people didn't listen. And so then that anger may actually escalate into a more intense form or a dangerous form to get people's attention so that they get heard. So the behaviors that they engage in are based on this behavior having some type of success for them in the past. That's where it comes from. And so a lot of times when we talk with people, when they're trying to deal with someone who is engaging in risky behavior, is that I'll hear a lot, well, they know what they're doing. In some sense, they do, but do they have complete control over it? They know what they're doing in the sense of that this comes from a place where they have fear. They may have depression, but the anger is how they resolve the uncomfortable feelings in them and get their needs heard and met. So it may feel very manipulative, but it's also because they don't have other ways of coping with the world. People may not have taken the time to help them work through these emotional experiences and to help them develop other ways of coping. Or it may be that the people in their world never did really listen to them until they became intense. But the three basic trauma responses are in relation to that part of our nervous system that gets activated when we feel fear is either to fight, to flee, or to freeze. We'll be talking mostly about fight today. The people who show angry aggression, hostility, may resort to violence as a way to interact with their world. But there are other things that can be dangerous for people. Fleeing can be as well. We've seen individuals that when they have this uncomfortable feeling in them is that their instinct is to run. And, you know, they may run into the woods or they may run into the street. They may say, I wish I could die, right? Because they feel so uncomfortable inside, they're just looking for a way to resolve that feeling. For others, it is to freeze and shut down. For instance, one of my traumas in my life that I've shared before was that when I had a surgery when I was very young, I came out of anesthesia and they had to reinduce that anesthesia. So throughout my life, I've had a sensitivity to things like doctor shows and shows about hospitals, or even people talking about surgeries. And what happens to me is I start to feel nauseous and anxious. I'll get sweaty and dizzy, and I'll feel like I'm going to pass out. So my trauma response is really a freeze response, and it's my body shutting down to get rid of the uncomfortable feeling that I'm going through, even though I have no explicit memory of that event in my life. So freeze is another response we need to be watchful for and also mitigate for. Because when people have that response, oftentimes they just are quiet. They may go sit in a corner by themselves. They kind of isolate themselves. But they really don't cause any other problem, right? And so a lot of times those people get overseen and we don't pay a lot of attention to them. So just keep that in mind. So Also, the trauma response itself can impact the expression of mental health symptoms. So as anxiety rises in an individual, they are more likely to have the florid symptoms of schizophrenia, such as hallucinations and delusions. If they're obsessive compulsive, they'll want to be more organized because that's how they feel comfortable in the world, right? If everything is in its place and everything has a place, that helps them feel less anxiety and more comfortable with themselves. With depression, more anxiety a person has, that fear creates more depression because they feel even more helpless and hopeless in their current situation. If someone has bipolar disorder, it may trigger manic responses where the person doesn't sleep anymore, or sleeps very little. They're very active. They have a fast train of thought. They engage in more risk types of behavior. They may steal. They may engage in risky sexual behavior, things of that nature as well. So the trauma response itself, we know, will exacerbate any type of mental health concern that the individual has. Any questions? We're good? Okay.
You're good right now. Go right ahead. Oh, Pam
So,
says, Dean, how often would you say this increase in mental health symptom is due to trauma?
well, I don't know if you can really separate the two. I think, any stress in a person's environment, and stress is, if you want to define it broadly, is any change that we experience, even if it's a positive change. So something like, somebody starting a new job, think back to when you started your current job with the Fairfield County Board of DD. Think about that first day. Did you feel anxiety? Even though it was a positive change in your life because things were more unpredictable, they're unfamiliar, you're worried about your relationships with new people, of learning new systems, all that kind of stuff. Even though we see that as a positive thing, it creates anxiety. Now, if you have a mental health disorder, it's likely that those symptoms will be exacerbated by that experience of anxiety, even though one might call it a positive anxiety. So anything that goes on that creates anxiety, even if it's not connected to trauma, can exacerbate those mental health symptoms. So let's talk about basic prevention and management strategies to begin with. And these are things I know that a lot of people already know about and already do, but I just like to review them quickly. The first thing is always to establish a relationship with the person, get to know them. And I know from working a number of people on your team, you guys do a great job at that. You go to people who know the person, you talk to the ISCs, you talk to me, you talk to anybody who's been involved with the individual to get those little nuggets of knowledge of who this person is. But it's also about being with that person and getting to know them and kind of joining them in their world, finding out what is of interest to them, what are their strengths, what do they feel comfortable doing, what do they think that they want to do, right? All those things, when we take interest in someone, that builds a relationship. When we allow someone to talk about themselves, right, it makes them feel important. Just like you inviting me here to talk with you today, that develops relationship for me with you because you make me feel important today. You make me feel good about myself. And we all need that. We all need that opportunity to feel good about ourselves and to know that people are interested in us. And if you want to influence someone, I went to a whole course on how to influence people one time. And really the major nugget I took away from, and this was like a week-long training, But the major nugget I took away from that is if you have a relationship with someone, you can influence them. And so that's the most important thing, is being able to, because we can take criticism from someone that we feel connected with. We can take constructive feedback. We can take correction and redirection. If I don't know you, then, and I don't have a relationship, then I wonder about what your motives are when you're trying to direct me. And that will create anxiety, and anxiety, as it builds, can create other problems for the individual. Learning what triggers an individual with a mental health issue and a trauma background, because we're just going to assume all the people that we work with have some type of trauma in their life that impacts how they engage the world. So personal space, key, right? What type of personal space does this individual need? How do I approach them? How do I, when I want to talk with them and educate them and engage them, what is the best way in personal space to do that? How should I approach them? Can I approach them differently when they're having a good day versus they're having not such a good day? You know, we know that we want to be at eye level, maybe more off to the side, not directly from the front or back, especially when trauma history is involved. Touch is critical. Oftentimes when people start to escalate, and if we have a relationship with them, touch can be very good, right? You know, I imagine that once the COVID virus thing is over, you know, people are going to be like touch deprived. And I can imagine, you know, people seeing each other at work again, and there's probably going to be lots of hugging going on, right? Because we've had that touch deprivation. We need touch. Touch releases biochemicals in us that make us feel good. So, you know, but if someone is anxious, if someone has a trauma history that involved touch, such as being overpowered by someone who abused them physically or sexually, can you use touch the same way? You know, there are individuals who allow touch if you ask permission first, but if you touch without permission, it can cause an instant escalation of behavior. Questions, verbal engagement, right? Sometimes people, if they're feeling anxious and you're talking to them, questions can become overwhelming when you're trying to learn about them, or you're trying to learn about what's going on right now. You know, what's going wrong with you? Can you tell me what's happening inside of you? And it's like, no, I'm overwhelmed already. Don't ask me questions. I'm just trying to hold myself together. So be careful how you use questions and when you use them. Look at all the different senses. Loud sounds is a common one for many of our individuals, often because they may have come from households where there was a lot of shouting, maybe doors slamming, things of that nature, maybe even gunfire, who knows? But loud sounds can be very traumatic for individuals. The words that we use, right? You may stumble upon a word that someone used to use with an individual, and all of a sudden it sets them off. Because the person who is a perpetrator perhaps used certain word combinations, and that may trigger an unconscious memory. Our tone of voice. So we have to try and be aware of a lot of things. May you still re-traumatize someone even if you feel like you know the person well? Yeah, because you may not know all the triggers. And we may never know all the triggers. The person probably doesn't know the triggers. I didn't understand my fainting until I was well into my 20s. And it was like all of a sudden it dawned on me. That's why I couldn't work on a human cadaver. You know, that's why when they rolled out the human cadaver, I fainted in the classroom and they had to haul me to the hospital. So, you know, because I always wondered, you know, why am I so sensitive to these things? And then it finally dawned on me one day. I was like, wow, I remember my mom telling me that story. I bet that's it. But then it was weird because once I made that connection, I became much more tolerant to my old triggers. It was kind of a weird experience. So as you work with individuals, if you can identify triggers and help them make those connections, it can actually help begin to resolve the impact of that those triggers have on the person. Remaining neutral and calm, which is always easier said than done, right? When everything else is in chaos, you know, we have to be the ones who are calm. The Crisis Prevention Institute calls it rational detachment. And to help you do that, it is to understand that what you're experiencing or what that person is experiencing really isn't because of you, but it's probably because of a history that we may not be completely aware of. So we have to try and not take these things personally, and we have to kind of be aware of how we need to manage our emotional response, because it's important to remember emotions are contagious, especially if we're not aware of that, or we lose that awareness. We can quickly be pulled into someone else's emotional experience. Other things that help with anxiety, creating familiarity, including skill mastery, right? The better we can do something without an audience, then once we have an audience, we can do it better. It's better to learn things away from an audience than in front of one. So doing simulations, doing role plays of new skills we want a person to have can be very helpful. Doing mass practices, helping them learn through chaining strategies, either forward or backward, where we break the activity down into its small steps and let them master small pieces of it at a time. Predictability is important to manage anxiety, which generally leads through depression and anger. So being on time is very important. Like if you're working with someone and you're late, they don't know what that means, because for many of our individuals with developmental disabilities, they have a hard time placing themselves in time. So being on time can be very important. Having routines, schedules, having picture schedules, so that even when they are feeling more stressed, the pictures may help them process the information more adequately. Creating choice for the individual, so that they are working on things according to their preference. Maybe they get to decide the order in which things get done, or even get to have the type of order they want in their environment. I work with one guy down in Vinton County, and he has a wide selection of CDs and DVDs, and he knows when one is out of place, and it creates great anxiety for him. It has to be in its place. Having, when do I get my breaks? How do I get my breaks? How, if I need a break when one isn't scheduled, but I'm feeling overwhelmed now, how do I get that break? And then also environmental management, knowing what type of environment works best for this individual, especially if they're learning new skills. What is the best environment for that? Is it being in the actual place, or do we simulate it? What are their sensory sensitivities? What type of sensory input do they need? Because sometimes we're very in tune to their sensitivities, but we're not real in tune to what they starve for. And so we also need to know what type of sensory input that they may need, whether it be physical activity, whether it be proprioceptive, like pressure on their joints or their body, or vestibular, right? Movement. All those things can be important too. So it's not just what they're sensitive to, but it may also be what they're insensitive to and need more of. And also realize that over time, those things change for us. As I've gotten older, I don't like crowds anymore. You know, I used to like going to places where there's lots of people, loud music, things of that nature. And now it's kind of like, well, no, I'd rather go someplace where it's a little bit quiet. I love going, like if I want to drink, I love going to bars where, you know, me and my wife are the only two people there. I find that much more fun than being around a bunch of people. So even as we get older and knowing, you know, with individuals that we work with that are older, what types of changes are they experienced that may create anxiety for them, such as changes in hormone levels, you know, women going through menopause, men losing testosterone. They experience changes in their sexual arousal and things of that nature, which can be frustrating and create anxiety and make them more vulnerable to the expression of their mental health symptoms as well. So how long are we supposed to go for anyway?
Dean, we're usually done with our full meetings around 9:30.
Okay, that's good. So I'm about halfway then.
Okay, that sounds good.
So I'll try not to talk so much so we get through everything. So the first stage of behavior escalation, and I'm taking this out of the Centers for Crisis Prevention, or CPI, Crisis Prevention Institute. Sorry, got the name wrong. So I'm kind of using their structure to take you through the escalation process. And the first stage is referred to as anxiety. So anxiety can take many different forms. You really have to know the individual to know what anxiety looks like for them. I've listed some of the common ones here. You know, whether it, and for some it may be avoiding eye contact. For others, it's intensive eye contact. For some, it's not talking. For others, it's talking incessantly and rapidly. You know, so it varies from person to person. Tense muscles can be a sign, irritability, inability to focus. But what's really important here in this first stage of behavior escalation is that it's called, you know, anxiety escalation as well. So what does change in anxiety look like? So what, you know, from my audience here, and I know it's easier to do this in person, just shout out what you might see if someone's having a change in their anxiety level that should get your attention and get you thinking about, how do I now help this person? How do I now support this person? Anyone?
We have a comment in the chat that says pacing. Someone else says yelling.
Very good. Yeah.
I think crying can be one as well.
Sure.
I know that for my girls, a lot of times it's also like I can tell a change in their breath and how they're breathing and how they're holding themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That anxiety level starts to escalate.
Yeah. Change in how they talk, change in eye contact. You know, if they typically aren't real mobile and are like maybe sit around, when you see them becoming more active, that may be a sign. Or it could be the reverse, right? They start to shut down and become more quiet. So it really is any change in behavior that you notice could be a sign of increasing anxiety. And so it's important to kind of, you know, be in tune to and observing that person and seeing. Maybe it's asking a lot of questions, right? Am I doing this okay? Especially if you're doing more vocational types of things with an individual and they're learning a new job and they need that reassurance. With one person, you know, it's about reassuring him about whether he's going to be pink slipped or not. And he used to ask 50 times a day, am I going to be pink slipped today? Am I going to be pink? And he drove people a little bit crazy. But I said, you have to give him that reassurance. And I said, as long as you give that when he needs it over time, his need to hear that will decrease. But it took about a year for that to happen, because he had been to the hospital so many times and he was always so worried about going back to the hospital that was always on his mind. is something happening to me, or am I doing something that's going to cause someone to send me to the hospital? Even though it was very apparent to us, he was fine. But he didn't know how to judge that for himself. So some things to avoid when you notice increasing anxiety, and you've heard me talk about this as well as others. Avoid the no's, don'ts, and stop responses. Don't tell someone there's no reason to be anxious. There's no reason to be nervous. There's no reason to be upset. This is usually a good way to make people upset. I've done it in my own personal experience. And since my wife's in the house, I won't share that story today. So avoid being authoritarian, saying things like, that is inappropriate, that is wrong, right? Don't focus on the negative. Avoid using threats. If you can't control this, you can't work here, you can't be here. Avoid using shame. I would never do that to you. So, but a lot of these types of responses sometimes come out of us pretty naturally. So, it's hard because when I was raised, I heard a lot of those things. And so they kind of get ingrained in our mind as a way to give people feedback about their behavior. But with someone who has significant mental health, has a trauma history, they have a great deal of difficulty dealing with these types of responses as ways to be supported. So the basic intervention we want to use here is what we call reflecting, honoring, and connecting, or what I will also refer to as active listening. And you may use all these steps in this type of support, or you may just use one or two of them. It depends on the situation. So it may, first you want to do is reflect what you're seeing in that person, what their experience is. And again, you want to be careful, because also sometimes we don't like being told exactly what it is we're feeling. That can cause a defensive response as well. So you may say something like, you look upset. You look like you want to fight someone, right? Are you feeling like no one cares right now? You just want to let them know that you're seeing a change in them, that you're seeing a level of uncomfortableness in them, and that you're hearing them, even though they may not be saying it, that what they're communicating, you are responding to. You may at that point, or not, ask them what has happened. What is upsetting you? We don't want to use the phrase, what is wrong with you? Right? It's not about anything being wrong with them. It is about understanding that they're having a real experience in their life, and that we are going to respect it, and that this experience comes from someplace. But we also know with a lot of our individuals, they really don't know where it comes from. They don't understand where it comes from. So sometimes asking this question can also be stressful for them, because they want to be able to answer it, but they can't. So you need to know that individual, and would this question be helpful or not? Provide a supportive statement. I can understand why that would be upsetting if they're telling you what's going on. And I always like to use the one example of the individual when we were still doing services at the Opportunity Center, and this person was coming at me. And boy, I could tell he was ready to go. And I knew he was upset, and I knew I was the only one in the hallway, and I knew I needed to do something. So as he came up to me, I just simply said, "Wow, you look upset." And just by saying that, by recognizing him before he even had to say anything to me, he just stopped and he looked at me. And I just said, "Well, what happened?" And he told me what happened. And then when I said, well, I can understand why that made you upset. Now, to me, personally, if it would have happened to me, it would have been a very small thing and it wouldn't have been very upsetting to me. But by saying I can understand why that would upset you, let him know that it was okay for him to feel that way and he was already being heard and he did not need to intensify to get me to hear him. And you could just see him start to let the emotion go at that point. So if they can tell you what happened, it's just very good to then validate that it's okay to have this emotion, because emotions are a personal experience. But then honor that person for sharing. Thank them for that. Let them know, yeah, it's hard to share sometimes. I'm glad you were able to share. But you can even honor the person even after you reflect. Thanks for letting, you look upset. Thanks for sharing that emotion with me. That's how someone feels supported. And then the last step would be to connect them to some type of positive outcome. You can simply tell the person something like, it will get better. It's not always going to be like this. And I think that's very important right now with the virus thing going on, because I've been talking to parents and some providers where individuals are really struggling with their anxiety around this, because as much anxiety as we have, they even have greater difficulty understanding exactly what's going on. And when things aren't predictable, like for this one person, it's not knowing when Kings Island is going to open now. We think about that and say, well, God, that's the least of our worries. But for this person, it's important, right? And they need reassurance that things will get better eventually, that this is short term. Or how can I help, right? How can we make this better together? Now, sometimes you may get a request that you can't do. You're transparent. You let people know what you can and can't do. And they may still get upset that you can't do everything that you want, that they may want you to. But oftentimes that helps them also understand.
Dean, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So someone that has experienced anxiety or trauma, and what I've learned, that's a reflection kind of that lost sense of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And would you say that this reflecting, honoring, and connecting is kind of a way to show them that they're safe and to kind of reinstate that sense?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. That's a great way of putting it. You're letting them know that they're not alone. If you say something, when someone is upset, even if we think it's something small or it would be something small in our personal world, letting them know that they're not alone is so important, right? If you've ever, I've lost a parent, I've lost friends to illness already in my life. My brother's lost a wife to a motorcycle accident, and people always say, you don't know what to do when someone experiences something that traumatic in their life. But simply being there with them is so critical. I remember, my brother's 4 years older than me. He's, he always picked on me. He always made fun of me. Even through our adulthood, he would do that. He always talked to me about being an overeducated idiot. He loved making fun. But when he lost his wife that time and I went back to Green Bay to see him, I could tell that just being there with him is what he needed. He didn't need any magic words from me. All he needed to know is that he wasn't going to be alone going through this. And that was the first time we ever hugged. Otherwise, my brother and I had never hugged before. And he just about killed me with the hug, because it was so important for him. But yeah, just knowing that we're, that we're accepting them for who they are. Who doesn't like that? Right? You know, and I always use the example of when I came and worked for the board and people were like, God, I'm glad you're here. You know, who doesn't like that? You know, and people say, well, you know, if you're too nice to people, you just spoil them and they won't work hard. Do you think when all those people told me when I first started this job that they were glad I was there, that that made me want to work less hard? Absolutely not. You know, it's like that made me want to work even harder. You know, that type of connection is very strong. It's very powerful. And if you use something like this consistently with people, you know, and you got to find a way to use it that it doesn't sound fake or made up. It does need to be meant. Because the other thing we have to remember about people that have trauma history is they know when people are being genuine and when they're not. You know, so if you kind of go through this robotically and you're not really connecting with the individual, it won't work. But if you can engage them and if you can truly be there in that moment with them, it changes. It'll change how the physiology of their body is responding. It will help them self-calm. It turns down some of that volume. Anything else before we move on? Okay.
Good.
I'm just going to talk real quick about some coping strategies and just remind people, you know, especially if people have had mental health concerns as well. A lot of times they have psychiatrists, they have counselors, psychologists involved with them. They have caseworkers from the mental health side working with them. Find out what's been worked on with this individual. What is in their tool chest? What has been worked with them? And what has helped and what hasn't helped, right? This is another resource that we may miss sometimes in working just because it's sometimes hard to connect with them. But there are other people out in the community, other stakeholders that help support the individual that can be critical in helping us understand who the person is as well, too. I always like to use normalizing, letting them know that they're not the only one that screws up. They're not the only one that gets afraid. You know, if I'm with someone who's afraid, I may share with them things that frighten me, right? And I've gotten through it, and so can you, kind of talk. Reinterpret their experience for them. Because sometimes they're actually doing better, but the individuals we work with are so used to being criticized, and the focus is always on what they've done wrong, that they can't see their own personal improvement. For instance, one time when an individual hit someone in the chest instead of in the head, guess what I did? I reinforced them. And people at first thought I was nuts. But changing behavior is a shaping process, right? This person showed a significant change. And I'd much rather have them hitting someone in the chest than hitting them in the face, right? As an initial step. You know, and I said, you know, you're doing better, right? And the person was like, I did? I hit him. Even the person thought I was a little bit crazy at first. Why would you be congratulating me for hitting someone? You told me I shouldn't be hitting people. And I said, but you controlled yourself. You controlled yourself more where you chose to hit them someplace where it would be less likely that you would harm that person. And it's okay. Sometimes we need to get ourselves, because especially in our society, and you know, at our talk yesterday, this was talked about, right? You know, do we have a negative attitude about what's going on around us or a positive attitude? So even when we're working with difficult individuals, we have to take even those small things and we need to make them larger, those small successes, not only for ourselves and our own personal resilience, but for that person's personal resilience as well. You can use an emotional identification scale. In my next slide, I'll show one of those. Have they learned deep breathing? Have they learned self-talk strategies? Do they use journaling? Do they use distraction? Right? What works for them? These are just some basic coping strategies that can be used with individuals. You know, it could also be, you know, distraction can be things like exercise, going for a walk, listening to music, going into a quiet room away from people. So these are broad categories. And so find out what types of coping strategies the individual has at their disposal. This is an example of an emotional zone chart that we developed for one of our individuals. And in it, throughout the day, the mother works with this individual on finding out where he is on his emotional scale. Right, excuse me, right now this is done pretty much hourly. You know, so if he's feeling good, that's what happens there. I can do my regular schedule with my scheduled times for preferred activities, sensory, etc. If he's saying I'm in yellow or pointing to yellow, you know, he's indicating I'm upset. And this is what I can do to help me when I'm upset. If I'm in red, I'm angry now, and this is what I need to be able to do. I need to be able to blow off steam. We do this because, heck, you know, we say individuals with developmental disabilities struggle with identifying their emotional states. They're not the only ones. You know, did you ever bite someone's head off and then later walk away and go, where in the heck did that come from? Right? You know, the other day I was frustrated with the computer. And so it was last week, Tuesday morning, my first day at home, and I couldn't get things to work right. And I was, you know, it's like my first day working from home and I couldn't get anything to work right. And I was getting so frustrated. And so I decided I'm going out in the barn to do chores first. And I went out in the barn and I got bad at something, I can't remember what, and I slammed the lid on the cat food container and broke it. You know? And I didn't even realize myself that I needed to do some coping. We let our own emotions overrun us at times too. You know, we're not that different than the people we support, or at least I'm not. I don't know what that says about me, I guess. But you can create these for an individual. And if you ever need help doing that, I have some other formats I have saved on my computer, like I have a superhero angry scale, you know, things like that that can be helpful. I have one that has the different just round faces, like a smiley face, a neutral face, a sad face, an angry face. So you can do all different types of configurations. There's a lot of things out on the internet that can help you put these things together too. But helping, you know, if the person is, especially if they're used to using something like that, and now you're working with them, to use this as a coping skill can be very helpful for you and the individual. So stage 2 is the defensive stage. So this is where the emotional brain begins to take control of the thinking brain. Rational thought, reasoning, and planning begin to be compromised and decompensate. The goal here is to decelerate the escalation process, not to bring them immediately into calm. Interventions will become more directive during this stage of escalation, and directives need to be simple and to be completed easily. And it could be something as simple as, let's go for a walk, right? So what might defensiveness look like? Well, the first step may be questioning, and it may be even just a rational question. But when someone starts to question, start thinking, are they moving from anxiety into an escalation phase here? But if they're asking just a rational question, provide a rational answer. It's usually about fairness. For instance, you know, we're training someone to do a job and we tell them, you know, every time you go to the bathroom, you have to wash your hands. Because people that we work with are told to do so many things, They begin to think the only reason they're being asked to do them is because they have a developmental disability or they have a mental health problem, and no one else has to do this stuff. I see people leave the bathrooms all the time without washing their hands. Why do I have to wash my hands? Right? And then you may say, well, you know what? Everyone here is supposed to wash their hands. Right? Sometimes people choose not to, but that can be dangerous, especially today, right? If we don't wash our hands, we can pass along a dangerous virus. So they want to, if they're asking a rational question, they want to know if they're being treated fairly. However, questions can also escalate from there to challenging questions, you know, where they're challenging your authority. You know, when you're asking me to do something, I may say something along the lines, well, who made you boss? Right? And throw a little attitude in there. So we know they're now escalating and they're truly in a defensive response. Rationality is going to start to be lost. And really what they're trying to do is pull you into a power struggle. And it could be for a number of reasons. The anxiety is getting high. I need to resolve this anxiety, right? So you may take a step back and use coping skills, use the connecting and the honoring phrasing with them as well. So you just don't use these in order. You can choose and pick how you want to use them too. But if they're really challenging and trying to manipulate you into that power struggle, you know, kind of downplay it. You know, they may call you a name. You know, I see this in a lot of our home environments. We have, you know, we have Black providers with white young men that are 19 years old. And so they know how to get a rise out of them is to use the N-word, right? And he's expert at pulling people into these power struggles. But it's hard to ignore that, right? When somebody says something so derogatory, or they call a woman a bitch or a slut and use that type of language, yeah, that emotion becomes very contagious, doesn't it? And, you know, it's hard to stay rationally detached, but that's our initial job. So that's what I mean by downplaying that question, is just staying rationally detached and just try and use maybe some of your other prevention strategies to get them on task. Take them back to that schedule. Take them back to that checklist. Those other things you have in place to help make life predictable and familiar for them, to just kind of get them off of that. Use distraction, right, to help them change their emotional state. But if you need to direct them, make, again, the directive simple, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those, and use tools to assist with the processing of that direction. Use that schedule, use that checklist along with them to help the processing. Defensive stage, step 2, refusal. I ain't doing it. You can't make me. I have rights. How many of you have heard that phrase, right? We've done a very good job of teaching people with developmental disabilities their rights. They know their rights better than I know mine. I'll guarantee you that. So during this stage, we have a continued loss of rationality. We have use of limit setting strategies here. But it's important to know that when you're in this stage, that limit setting is not about forcing compliance. It is about providing choice still. It's not about winning the power struggle. It should never be about compliance and winning the power struggle. Because when you win the power struggle, you still lose, right? We all know that. We've all heard that from other trauma-informed workshops we've been at. If you win the power struggle, you're like every other perpetrator, anybody else who took advantage of this person's vulnerability in the past. Worse yet, if you lose, you're like everybody else who failed to protect them And now how are you going to protect me? So, you have to realize that none of this, when you're dealing with escalating behavior, is about winning. It is about providing choice for the individual and honoring them. So limit setting is about choice. Keep that in mind. Let's talk about some ways to do limit setting. So we have what may be referred to as an interrupt and redirect pattern. And I use this quite a bit with individuals. So it may sound something like this. John, you are shouting. I will still hear you if you speak softly. And then I got to make sure I do hear them and respond to them. But or I may say something like, you're talking really loud. Let's talk when you're a little bit calmer, and I'll be able to hear you better. So again, it's a choice, right? I'm not telling them to shut up. I'm not telling them that they have to talk softer. What I am doing is giving them a choice. Use a when and then pattern or a first then pattern. So it may be something like, when you finish cleaning the bathroom, you will have time for a break. Right? First we do this, then this can happen. Because they may just really want to have a break, and maybe they do need that break right then and there. That's a decision every support person will need to make. But sometimes just knowing and being reminded when that break comes. Or after you do this task that you don't like doing so much, guess what? You get to do something really fun. Oh, okay. I forgot about that. And then what I call choice and consequence. Or it's kind of like truth and consequence. Anyone here old enough to remember the old game show, Truth and Consequences? Okay. So anyway, you always start by providing what the preferred behavior is with a positive consequence, followed by what the less preferred behavior is and the consequence that may go along with that. So by completing the bathroom now, you'll be able to help customers the rest of the day. If you don't clean the bathroom, you will not be able to help the customers. Now, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that if we're going to attach a consequence to something, then we have to make sure it happens, right? Sometimes people will escalate at the consequence. So again, you need to know the individual. Try it out, see if it works. But, if they don't follow through with the first part, then the consequence has to be there. Or that will just strengthen that disruptive behavior pattern that we're trying to support this individual through. Because that old pattern from earlier in their life now has grown stronger. I've now gotten you to buy into my pattern. Because remember, we're all creatures of pattern and habit, right? And even if a new pattern is good for us, we often don't choose it because we like staying with what is familiar to us. That's how important familiarity and predictability is to managing anxiety. And I always use the example when I used to do some counseling, and I used to work with women who came out of homes where there was domestic violence, and they would just finally, after years of struggle, get themselves out of such a bad situation. And in 6 months to a year, they're right back in it. I actually work with a family right now where the mother of the individual that we serve went back and married the individual who abused her again, because she wanted to live in a nicer house. And I'm just like, oh my God, I can't even imagine the emotional strain that must exist in that home. if that's the reason you chose to remarry, right? God. But so anyway, it's important to remember, but again, it's about providing choice. If you do this, this is the positive consequence that comes with that. If you choose to stay in this old pattern, this is what you can continue to expect. And will they always make the right choice according to what we think is the right choice? Of course not. But hopefully over time, as we prevent choice, and from time to time they try a new choice, the behavior begins to change slowly. It's just like I was talking with a family this week over Zoom, and this person has a fluid restriction, but we don't enforce it strictly because it doesn't work. So we're trying to shape that behavior slowly, and we're gradually getting there. But it's frustrating for the family as well, because they want, all of us, we're so used to an instantaneous society that we just expect interventions should have immediate and complete impact. And they do have immediate impact, but the notice of that impact may have to accrue over time. So we also have to show patience. And then there's step 3, release. Okay, this is the verbal and emotional outburst, the loss of rationalization. We're now in full fight, flight, or freeze, right? Depending on what's dominant for the individual. The person now, their focus is survival, right? Whether it's rational survival or irrational survival, to them it is just simply about survival. They're resolving their feelings, they need to feel safe, and they need to regain control in the way they know how to do it best. And this can be a very uncomfortable situation, right? When someone is kind of having what we traditionally call the meltdown. So have a safe place for this individual to go, to get away from audiences, to get away from their sources of stress. Use simple directives, because processing is going to be very limited. Walk with me. Don't even put in extra words like, why don't you go get your jacket and then we'll go for a walk outside. Too much to process. Just say, walk with me, sit with me. Just see if you can get some type of response from that individual. You can again use the honoring statements as well. They may not be able to hear everything that you have to say, but you can go back to that kind of reflect and honor and connect process again. If you need to direct that person through a number of steps, break it down into single steps. Walk with me. Walk with me to the sensory room. When you're in the sensory room, sit with me. And then just allow time and space for the individual to self-calm. We're not going to go into the final stage, which is, the harm stage, because we're not going to talk about holds and things of that nature today. But then I'm going to call this, the next stage is the tension reduction. This is when finally the motion is resolved and now they collapse, right? So you see a dramatic reduction in physical and emotional energy. This is the time where you start to reestablish that relationship rapport with the individual. The individual may become tearful, apologetic. They may even have incontinence at this point as they release. They may have confusion about the experience of emotions that just happened. Asking them right then and there, what happened to you? And they say, I don't know. It's likely they don't, right? Because their emotional brain just kind of took over at that point. And it's important to remember here that tension reduction takes longer than behavior escalation more often than not. So, and that's why it's hard to engage in de-escalation processes, because sometimes that thermometer shoots up so fast. It's you know, you're kind of taken by surprise. And that's why going over these things and developing your own personal strategies for how to use these techniques will become important for you. So perhaps 20 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes into that tension reduction phase, you can use what I refer to as, or what's referred to as, a set communication. And this isn't the only strategy you can use. You can use the reflect and honor type of communication. Again, you can just use silence sometimes, right? You can use physical comforting. There's all types of things you can do. You can just say to the person, it's going to be okay. But if you do need to talk with someone about taking responsibility or accountability for what has just happened, this is a way to kind of set it up. So you start with a supportive I statement. I'm concerned about the way you reacted when I asked you to clean the bathroom, right? And then next statement would be empathetic. I understand that you want to be able to do only the parts of the job you like to do. And you would prefer that I just leave you alone. Keep my nose out of it. Let me do what I want, right? That's a lot of times what we all want, right? We want to be able to do what we want to do. But then you can present the truth statement. The purpose of the supportive and empathetic statement is to let the person know that you're there with them and you care. And hopefully it allows them to be able to hear the truth at that point, as opposed to just going into, you can't work here if you do things like that. So the truth statement may be something like, anyone who does this job has to also clean the bathroom. And so I may even use some normalizing strategies, you know, saying to them, you know, there's parts of my job I don't like. And I may share what those parts are, but I won't share those with you today because I don't want it to get to the wrong people. So, you know, again, normalizing that so that they understand that what they're being asked to do is fair, that it's not unlike what other people have to go through as well.
Dean, I just wanted to give you a 5-minute warning.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
I'm on my last slide. I'm doing good, better than usual. I'm proud of myself. Get off my back. Okay, so the nature of relationships, just some quick things for you to continue to think about as you think about supporting people and supporting people through behavior escalations and recovery from them. One is a history of being vulnerable and not protected is the story of so many of our people, and I really just think about it in terms of all our people. When I think about how vulnerable they are to such a complex society and growing up and understanding what I had experienced in my own personal life, you know, it's important to keep that in mind. They see the world differently. It's like wearing a pair of scratched up sunglasses, right? If you have mental health problems and you have significant trauma that's impacted your development, you know, it's like putting on this pair of sunglasses that's all scratched up and everything you see gets filtered through that. That's the same for the people that we work with. Their experiences of the world get filtered through these kind of scratched up sunglasses and everything gets distorted. And they see things differently than what a typical person may have the opportunity to see them as. So don't feel like you're being manipulated. Understand that their experience in the world is just so different than ours. The pattern, and this pattern is repeated throughout their life. You know, we work with so many individuals, you know, They got taken out of the biological parents' home. They were put in the foster care. They failed there. I've had kids, you know, that are adults now that were kicked out of specialty residential programs, right? These, you know, and you think of the repetition that occurs and how ingrained these trauma patterns and survival patterns get made into their life. So they expect that pattern to continue. So when you come into their life, they expect you to be the same way as everybody else has been. You'll tolerate them for a while, and then you will disappear too, or you will send that person someplace else, or you too will give up on them. But the strange thing is when they start developing trusting relationships, this can cause anxiety too, right? Because the more trust you have in someone, but the less experience you have with having successful trust, that can cause anxiety because you begin to anticipate. And the closer you get to that individual, the more vulnerable you become, right? The better we get to know someone, the more intimate parts of our life we share with people, the more vulnerable we become, which makes us more susceptible to anxiety. So when that trust develops, you may see that person attempt to test that relationship. Will you still be there? Or they may attempt to want to stay in their old pattern. You know, get away from me, stop liking me, stop caring about me. I'm not worthy to be cared about. And I've had people say that. I mean, how sad is that for someone to say, I'm not worth being cared about? So your support must reflect that ultimate goal for all the individuals that we work with, and that is to be safe and to have a sense of control in their life. Our goal has to be their goal. Our goal can't be compliance, because if it is compliance, we truly can't be successful, because they will have to fight that, because if they give in, that's the re-traumatization. And that's why sometimes you just see individuals struggle so much with pure kind of behavioral strategies, because you do feel manipulated. I have felt manipulated. Like even in my previous job, you know, they said, well, if you meet this goal and that goal and that goal, you know, which were goals that were more financially oriented, and I'm not oriented that way very well, you know, we'll give you more money. But it's like, that wasn't my idea of success. And so it actually demotivated me in that job. So thanks for listening to me. We're about right on time. Any quick questions before we stop today?
Pam says, people who heavily use the mental health and DD system are used to having relationships broken, but it's often out of their control. Being forced to test and break a relationship is a way to keep that control.
Yeah.
So not really a question, just a statement.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment, Pam. I agree with that 100%. You know, I'm going to cut off the relationship before you do. Yeah. Any other comments? Okay, well, thanks for listening. I hope this was helpful. It was a little strange talking to myself in my dining room.
Dean, we really appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you.
Thanks for your help, April. I appreciate it.
Yep.
And you all stay healthy and safe, okay?
You do.
Thank you, Dean.
You too.
Thanks,
Thanks, Dean.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.